November 28, 1944. Under the cover of darkness, the largest aircraft carrier the world has ever seen slips out of Yokosuka Naval Base for its maiden voyage. The Shinano is a massive armored leviathan, but its cargo exposes a much darker reality. Stowed deep within its cavernous hangar decks are 50 Ohka rocket planes and 6 Shinyo fast boats. These are suicide craft, weapons that require no trained pilots, only men willing to die. How did the absolute pinnacle of Japanese naval technology, designed to project supreme power across the oceans, become nothing more than a delivery truck for a desperate weapon of last resort? History often reduces the destruction of this giant ship to a quirky tactical anecdote, a story of a lone American submarine on routine lifeguard duty getting incredibly lucky and taking down a 72,000-ton behemoth in the dark. But focusing solely on the torpedoes misses a far darker and more profound historical puzzle. The real question is one of impossible timing. Why was the biggest, most heavily armored aircraft carrier in history completed at the exact moment the Imperial Japanese Navy had already lost the very thing that gave a carrier its power? By the time Shinano finally slipped its moorings, the vast, complex ecosystem of elite aviators, specialized training pipelines, and high-octane fuel that made such a monumental vessel necessary had been utterly obliterated. The ship was a technological masterpiece, born into an absolute strategic vacuum. It was a colossal floating paradox, an engineering triumph built to support a carrier strike force that physically no longer existed. To understand the complete absurdity of this leviathan hauling rocket-powered suicide bombs into the Pacific in late 1944, we cannot start with its final voyage. We first have to examine the entirely different strategic reality of its inception. We have to look back at exactly what this massive steel hull was actually supposed to be when it was first laid down in the spring of 1940. In May 1940, Yokosuka Naval Shipyard began work on a massive steel structure known simply as Hull 110. Planners in Tokyo never intended for this vessel to have a flight deck. It was laid down as the third unit of the Yamato-class, a monstrous super-battleship designed for a single purpose. At this moment, Japanese naval planners were anchoring their entire national survival to a rigid, steel-clad doctrine born from historical myth, the Kantai Kessen, or the decisive naval battle. This concept was the theological centerpiece of the Imperial Japanese Navy, tracing its lineage back to the crushing victory at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. The doctrine postulated that any future naval conflict, particularly one against the expanding power of the United States, would be decided not by a prolonged war of attrition, but by one catastrophic, apocalyptic afternoon of battleship gunnery. Planners were painfully aware of the fundamental conflict facing the empire. They knew that in any conventional struggle, Japan could never compete with the quantitative industrial output or population resources of the United States. Therefore, their strategy had to counter numerical superiority with overwhelming individual quality. The logic was clear. Since Japan was industrially incapable of winning a numerical race, each Japanese ship, gun, and sailor had to be mathematically superior to multiple American equivalents. Hull 110, the future Shinano, along with its sister ships Yamato and Musashi, was designed to be the ultimate expression of this individual superiority, an engineering marvel whose thick armor and unprecedented displacement would render it functionally invincible, allowing it to annihilate any American task force in a single engagement. In 1940, this pre-war mindset ignored the emerging, yet still unproven, potential of naval aviation, prioritizing immense engineering over operational flexibility. The Japanese doctrine was absolute, anchored in dreadnought supremacy and a profound strategic inertia that dismissed the capabilities of aircraft carriers as secondary tools, suitable only for scouting or harassment, not the systemic destruction of a battle line. Japanese confidence was ironclad, but it was anchored to a pre-war vision that war itself would render obsolete before the monster hull was launched, a conflict between rigid doctrine and the rapidly changing reality of aerial warfare. That rigid, steel-clad confidence held for precisely 19 months. Then, the reality of modern war violently shattered it. The opening acts of the Pacific War fundamentally dismantled the battleship era in rapid, explosive succession. The devastating strike on Pearl Harbor and the tactical stalemate at the Coral Sea proved the deadly reach of carrier aviation. But it was in June 1942 that the Japanese High Command suffered a trauma that permanently altered naval history. At the Battle of Midway, within a matter of hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 4 frontline fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. It was a catastrophic, unrecoverable destruction of offensive power. The theoretical debate over naval doctrine ended instantly. The battleship, no matter its armor thickness or gun caliber, was exposed as a slow, vulnerable liability. Naval supremacy now belonged definitively and exclusively to the aircraft carrier. The ability to project lethal force from over the horizon, far beyond the range of the largest artillery shells, was the only metric that mattered. This realization triggered a massive panic within Japanese naval planning. They had structured their entire war effort around a battleship doctrine that had just evaporated in the flames of Midway. Consequently, the colossal steel skeleton of Hull 110, sitting partially finished in Yokosuka Naval Shipyard, suddenly represented a profound strategic liability. It was consuming critical resources and dry dock space for a type of warfare that no longer existed. The Japanese command issued a radical, desperate change of orders. The construction of the 3rd super-battleship was halted. Instead, the Imperial Japanese Navy demanded that this massive hull be transformed into a carrier. It is an incredible historical paradox. The very ship that was conceived as the absolute ultimate expression of the battleship era was violently repurposed for the exact reason that the war had proven battleships obsolete. The highest achievement of one technological epoch was cannibalized to serve the next. But the Japanese were not simply going to bolt a flight deck onto a battleship hull and call it a standard fleet carrier. They understood the vulnerabilities of carriers. They had just lost 4 of them because their flight decks were unprotected and fragile. Therefore, the repurposed Hull 110, now officially named Shinano, was not designed to be just another ship. It was intended to be a virtually unsinkable, heavily armored floating fortress. It was an engineering compromise, attempting to merge the defensive invulnerability of a battleship with the offensive projection of a carrier. However, the Japanese did not just want a tough ship. They designed Shinano to solve a very specific logistical nightmare that had emerged at Midway. They envisioned a completely new type of naval asset, one that wouldn't just launch its own aircraft, but would serve as a mobile reserve and repair hub for the rest of the fleet. This specific capability, the reason Shinano was built so massive, was designed to address a critical vulnerability. But as construction resumed on this new armored behemoth, the war was already quietly mutating, preparing a brutal reality that would render this specific capability entirely useless long before the ship ever touched the water. The solution to that critical vulnerability was supposed to be a revolution in naval architecture. When the naval architects and engineers at Yokosuka Naval Shipyard drafted the new blueprints for the repurposed Hull 110, they were not simply trying to replace the fleet carriers lost at Midway. They were trying to fundamentally redesign how a carrier task force operated in prolonged combat. The destruction of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had exposed a terrifying fragility, Fleet carriers were highly vulnerable when rearming and refueling their aircraft, caught with decks full of high-octane fuel and explosive ordnance. If Japan was going to survive the advancing American fleet, it needed a way to keep its frontline carriers fighting without exposing them to catastrophic risk. Shinano was engineered to be that solution. It was not designed to be a standard combat carrier. It was envisioned as a heavily armored, mobile aviation support base. The scale of the redesign was unprecedented. The ship retained the massive, cavernous beam and heavy torpedo bulges of the Yamato-class battleship, providing immense stability and underwater protection. But above the waterline, it was transformed into a floating fortress. The flight deck was not the standard wooden planking used by earlier Japanese carriers or their American counterparts. It was paved with solid steel armor plating nearly 4 inches thick, designed specifically to shrug off the 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs that had systematically vaporized the Japanese decks at Midway. This immense weight, high up on the ship, required complex metallurgical engineering and a complete recalculation of the vessel's center of gravity. The official, documented plans for Shinano reveal the true, unique nature of its intended role. The ship was assigned a surprisingly small organic strike group for its own immediate defense and limited offensive projection. The blueprints allocated space for roughly 40 highly advanced aircraft, specifically 18 A-7M Reppu fighters, the heavily anticipated high-performance successor to the legendary Zero, alongside 18 B-7A Ryusei torpedo bombers, and 6 high-speed C-6N Sayun reconnaissance planes. For a ship displacing over 72,000 tons fully loaded, an air group of 42 planes seemed absurdly, almost comically inadequate. An American Essex-class carrier, displacing roughly half the tonnage of Shinano, routinely carried over 90 aircraft into combat. But the 42 planes were merely Shinano's shield. The true purpose of the ship lay beneath the heavily armored deck, inside a vast, specialized labyrinth of hangars, workshops, and subterranean aviation magazines. Shinano was engineered with the immense internal capacity to store, fuel, arm, and perform heavy maintenance on approximately 120 additional aircraft. These were not intended to be her planes. They were the strategic reserve for the entire Imperial Japanese Navy. In the minds of the Naval High Command, the next decisive battle would see Shinano positioned safely behind the main carrier strike force. As frontline carriers like Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Taiho engaged the Americans, they would inevitably suffer aircraft losses and combat damage. Instead of retreating to distant land bases or waiting for slow, vulnerable transport convoys to bring up replacements, they would rely on the behemoth sitting just over the horizon. Shinano would operate as an unsinkable logistical heart. Its massive armored elevators would bring perfectly maintained, fully fueled, and heavily armed reserve aircraft up to the flight deck. Fresh pilots would launch from Shinano and fly directly onto the decks of the frontline carriers, instantly replenishing their strike groups in the middle of a massive ocean campaign. Furthermore, damaged aircraft from the front line could land on Shinano's thick armored deck to be taken down into the cavernous repair bays, where specialized mechanics could rebuild them far from the immediate danger zone. It was a brilliant, highly specialized tactical concept designed to give the Japanese fleet an unprecedented level of operational endurance. While thousands of laborers in Yokosuka worked around the clock, pouring millions of man-hours into realizing this massive logistical concept, a completely different reality was unfolding across the Pacific. To understand the profound tragedy of the Shinano, we must look at the enemy perspective. In Washington and across the sprawling industrial centers of the United States, the Department of the Navy was not looking for a single, invincible, heavily armored supercarrier to support its fleet. They were executing an industrial miracle that rendered the very concept of a single support ship irrelevant. The United States was actively flooding the Pacific Ocean with the Essex-class fleet carrier. These ships were being launched with a speed and efficiency that defied Japanese comprehension. But the American advantage was not merely a matter of rolling steel plates and welding hulls. The most lethal component of the American war machine was its approach to human capital. The United States had established a massive, highly standardized, and incredibly efficient pilot training pipeline. Across the vast, safe, uninterrupted skies of Texas, Florida, and California, tens of thousands of young Americans were being methodically processed through primary, basic, and advanced flight training. They were given hundreds of hours in the air practicing navigation, instrument flying, gunnery, and complex squadron tactics. Fuel was unlimited. Training aircraft were abundant. It was an assembly line producing competent, aggressive aviators by the thousands. Meanwhile, American naval intelligence was closely monitoring the Japanese home islands. High-altitude reconnaissance aircraft and intercepted communications indicated that something absolutely massive was taking shape in the heavily guarded dry docks of Yokosuka. American intelligence analysts knew a giant hull existed, but they completely misinterpreted its function. Viewing the intelligence strictly through the lens of their own naval doctrine, they assumed the Japanese were either stubbornly trying to finish a third Yamato-class battleship, or they were building a massive, traditional fleet carrier to compete with the Essex-class. The Americans had no conception of the hybrid logistical role the Japanese were attempting to engineer. They didn't realize Shinano was meant to be a floating aviation reserve, primarily because the United States didn't need one. When an American carrier lost its air group, the U.S. Navy simply sent another fully loaded carrier to take its place. As the American industrial and training machine accelerated into a terrifying overdrive, a fatal, irreversible flaw was quietly destroying the entire strategic foundation of the Shinano project. The fatal flaw was not in the steel armor, the steam turbines, or the design of the elevators. The flaw was the systemic destruction of the Japanese human capital. The entire operational concept of Shinano, a 72,000-ton ship explicitly designed to hold a reserve of 120 aircraft to replenish the fleet, rested on one fundamental, absolute requirement. There had to be 120 qualified, combat-ready pilots available to fly those reserve aircraft. Without the men, the massive hangars were just empty steel caves. And as the armor plates were being riveted onto Shinano's hull throughout late 1942 and 1943, that essential pool of men was bleeding to death in the humid skies over the South Pacific. To comprehend the sheer scale of this human disaster, we have to look at the campaign for Guadalcanal and the subsequent battles up the Solomon Islands chain, but we must look at them strictly through the lens of pilot attrition. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the war with an aviation corps that was arguably the most skilled and lethal in the world. But this supremacy was built on a deeply flawed, highly rigid training philosophy. The Japanese pre-war pilot training pipeline, famously centered around the Kasumi-Gouda training program, was intensely elitist. It was designed to produce a small, highly polished cadre of absolute masters. Out of thousands of eager applicants, only a tiny fraction survived the brutal, physically abusive, and hyper-competitive selection process. This boutique system produced the incredible aviators who devastated the Pacific in the opening months of the conflict, men who could fly the Zero with the precision of a surgeon. But this system was fundamentally incapable of mass production. It was designed for a short, victorious war, not a grinding industrial war of attrition. When the Guadalcanal campaign began in August 1942, the Japanese aviation ecosystem collided with a reality it was never designed to survive. The air war over the Solomons was not a single glorious, decisive afternoon of combat. It was a grueling, daily meat grinder that demanded immense physical and psychological endurance. Operating primarily from the major base at Rabaul, Japanese naval aviators were forced to fly grueling 4 to 5 hour transit missions straight down the slot just to reach the airspace over Guadalcanal. Once there, they engaged in desperate, high-G dogfights against American fighters, attempted to bomb heavily defended shipping, and then faced another exhausting 4 to 5 hour flight back over featureless, unforgiving open ocean, often in severely damaged aircraft with failing engines and leaking fuel tanks. Under this relentless, daily pressure, the irreplaceable core of the Japanese Naval Air Arm began to evaporate. They were not merely losing airframes, they were losing the very architecture of their squadrons. The veterans, the flight leaders, the section commanders, men with thousands of hours of peacetime flight experience, who knew how to navigate vast stretches of ocean through dead reckoning, who knew how to manage fuel consumption in a chaotic dogfight, who knew how to coordinate a complex, multi-squadron torpedo strike, were dying. They were being shot down by American wildcats. They were succumbing to exhaustion, or they were simply disappearing into the vast Pacific on the long flights home. The loss of these Pacific men was catastrophic because it created an uncontrollable death spiral. It takes years of rigorous training and hundreds of hours of flight time to forge a veteran flight leader. It takes only a single burst of .50 caliber machine gun fire to erase him forever. The rigid Japanese training pipeline, still clinging to its elite standards, could not replace these men. The Japanese were losing flight leaders faster than their system could produce basic rookies. As the veteran corps vanished, the Japanese High Command realized the existential threat to their fleet and desperately attempted to overhaul and accelerate their training programs. They tried to mimic the American mass production model, expanding class sizes and shortening the curriculum. But this effort was immediately strangled by a severe, insurmountable logistical crisis. By 1943, the American submarine blockade was effectively severing the empire's maritime lifelines, severely choking off the flow of oil from the Dutch East Indies. This created a direct, devastating impact on pilot training. Without high-octane aviation fuel, the accelerated training programs were paralyzed. Trainee pilots in the home islands were grounded. Their vital flight hours were drastically slashed. They were rushed through severely abbreviated syllabuses, spending their time listening to classroom lectures instead of sitting in a cockpit. They were not taught advanced overwater navigation. They were not given adequate live-fire gunnery practice, and, most crucially, they were never taught the intricate, instinctual team tactics that had made the Japanese squadrons of 1941 so devastatingly effective. When these green, barely trained pilots were finally sent to frontline carrier divisions or forward island bases, the results were an absolute slaughter. They were thrown into a highly complex, unforgiving aerial environment against increasingly experienced American aviators who were now flying vastly superior aircraft, like the heavily armored F-6F Hellcat. The new Japanese recruits lacked the fundamental situational awareness required to survive even their first few missions. They broke formation, they panicked under fire, and they fell from the sky in staggering numbers. Furthermore, the few surviving veterans in these squadrons were forced to spend their time and energy trying to protect the rookies, pulling them out of fatal mistakes. Consequently, the veterans themselves began to die at an even faster, more alarming rate. The entire ecosystem was collapsing under its own weight. Here lies the ultimate, tragic conflict of the Shinano project, a profound and undeniable disconnect between the manipulation of steel and the reality of flesh. Inside the heavily guarded, floodlit dry docks of Yokosuka, the absolute best minds of Japanese naval engineering were directing tens of thousands of laborers in an astonishing display of industrial willpower. They were pouring millions of man-hours into completing the massive hull. They were meticulously fitting heavy, Krupp-style armor plates, routing hundreds of miles of complex copper wiring, installing massive steam turbines, and constructing the vast subterranean hangar decks specifically designed to nurture, arm, and supply aircraft for the great decisive battle. They were systematically expending the rapidly dwindling, precious industrial resources of the Japanese Empire to create the absolute perfect support weapon for a carrier strike force. But the men required to make that weapon function were going extinct. A reserve aircraft, no matter how advanced its engine or how deadly its torpedo, is nothing more than a useless, static collection of aluminum, canvas, and magnesium without a highly trained human being sitting in the cockpit. The Japanese command was dedicating immense national treasure to building a colossal 72,000-ton toolbox for a fleet that no longer had any mechanics. The strategic logic of the ship was completely, hopelessly out of sync with the biological and educational reality of the war they were actually fighting. They were preparing a monumental vessel to replenish a fleet with machines, while stubbornly ignoring the absolute, irrecoverable destruction of their human capital. The Shinano was being built to support a phantom force. By the time Shinano's immense armored flight deck was finally taking shape, and its massive anti-aircraft galleries were being welded into place in the first half of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy's aviation ecosystem was effectively a hollow shell. The ship was still meant to be the great savior of the carrier fleet, a brilliant tactical innovation that would decisively turn the tide in the next massive fleet engagement. But the true depth of this human capital crisis, the sheer, terrifying extent to which the Japanese aviator had been degraded from an elite warrior to a barely trained liability, would not remain a secret hidden in the training squadrons for much longer. It was about to be violently, spectacularly exposed on the global stage, completely destroying the premise of the Shinano long before the giant carrier could even launch a single plane. In June 1944, the hidden rot within the Japanese aviation system was finally dragged into the open at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On paper, the Imperial Japanese Navy had assembled an apocalyptic strike force, 9 aircraft carriers launching hundreds of combat planes, aiming to shatter the American advance in a single decisive blow. It was the largest carrier fleet Japan had fielded since the disaster at Midway. But the men gripping the flight controls were the product of that broken, fuel-starved training pipeline. They were green, rushed trainees, navigating purely by instinct and fear, flying straight into an unbreakable wall of veteran American aviators and radar-directed anti-aircraft fire. The ensuing clash was not a battle. It was an execution. Without the tactical cohesion and situational awareness of their dead predecessors, the Japanese formations simply dissolved. Over 2 brutal days, the Japanese lost 3 carriers and the overwhelming majority of their deployed aircraft. The sheer scale of the slaughter permanently neutralized the Japanese carrier force as a viable offensive weapon. The system had entirely collapsed. The consequence of that collapse crystallized into a haunting, surreal image just 4 months later in October 1944. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, exactly 1 month before Shinano was scheduled to sail, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa took a task force of 4 carriers into the Philippine Sea. But this time, across 4 massive flight decks, he had barely 110 aircraft total. His hybrid battleship carriers, the Issei and Hyuga, sailed entirely devoid of planes. Ozawa was not sailing to strike the American fleet. He was sailing to be seen. In an act of supreme desperation, the remaining flight decks of the Imperial Navy were deliberately pushed forward as empty bait, a sacrificial decoy force designed solely to lure Admiral Halsey's American carriers to the north. The strategic disconnect had become absolute. Back in the Yokosuka shipyards, laborers were frantically welding the final steel plates onto the Shinano. Japan was expending its last ounces of industrial strength to complete the ultimate 72,000-ton support carrier. Its massive hangars and armored decks were explicitly engineered to keep a frontline carrier strike force supplied with fresh planes and rested pilots. Yet, at that exact moment, the frontline carriers it was built to protect were being intentionally fed to American dive bombers because they had no planes left to fly. The paradox was inescapable. If your active combat carriers are reduced to operating as empty, expendable decoys, what exactly is the point of a gigantic, heavily armored aviation support ship? The answer to that paradox lay in the darkest evolution of Japanese military strategy. With their conventional flight decks empty and their experienced pilots dead, the High Command embraced an unimaginably grim calculus. By the autumn of 1944, a green pilot could not survive the layered American anti-aircraft defenses or the swarms of Hellcats to deliver a conventional bomb. But if that pilot never intended to fly home, the math changed entirely. The organized kamikaze tactic was born not from spontaneous fanatical zeal, but from cold, logistical desperation. If an aviator lacks the training to drop a payload and pull away, the aviator simply becomes the payload. This doctrine reached its ultimate terrifying conclusion in the Yokosuka MXY-7 Ohka. The Ohka was not an airplane. It was a human-guided, rocket-propelled cruise missile packed with 2,600 pounds of explosives. Designed to be dropped from a heavy bomber, it required minimal flight instruction, just enough training to steer a diving rocket into the steel side of an American warship. This is the reality that finally answers the mystery of November 28th. When the Shinano slipped out of Yokosuka on its maiden voyage, its cavernous armored hangars were not filled with the glorious strategic reserve of Reppu fighters and Ryusei bombers it was engineered to carry. Instead, deep inside the heavily protected belly of this 72,000-ton Leviathan sat 50 Ohka flying bombs and 6 Shinyo suicide boats. The greatest surface combatant ever conceived by the Imperial Japanese Navy, first built to outgun American dreadnoughts, then radically redesigned to sustain a magnificent carrier strike force, had been reduced to a covert delivery truck. It was a steel freighter hauling weapons for the dead. Just a few dozen miles off the Japanese coast, the USS Archerfish was waiting in the darkness. The American submarine was not part of a coordinated strategic strike to eliminate the pride of the Japanese fleet. Under the command of Joseph Enright, the Archerfish was simply on routine lifeguard duty, positioned to rescue downed B-29 bomber crews. With no air raid scheduled that night, Enright was granted the freedom to hunt. At 8:48 p.m., radar operators aboard the submarine detected a massive surface contact. For the next 6 hours, the Archerfish relentlessly stalked the shadow, zigzagging across the black ocean. Enright, staring through the periscope, knew he was tracking something huge, perhaps a large fleet tanker or an escort carrier. But he had absolutely no idea he was looking at the largest, most secretive warship on Earth. At 3:15 a.m., the Archerfish finally slipped into a firing position. From just 1,400 yards away, Enright unleashed a spread of 6 torpedoes. 4 of them violently tore into the Shinano's starboard hull. By every metric of its original battleship design, the Leviathan should have absorbed the blow, but the Shinano had been rushed to sea dangerously unfinished. Below decks, miles of wiring and plumbing ran through bulkheads without proper watertight seals. Civil engineers and shipyard workers were still aboard, leaving heavy blast doors unlatched as they moved through the ship. Crucially, the green, hastily assembled crew had virtually no training in damage control. The Japanese engineering marvel had thick armor on the outside, but it was fatally porous on the inside. Progressive flooding surged uncontrollably through the massive internal compartments. The pumps failed. Just after 10 a.m. on November 29th, the colossal ship rolled over, tore itself apart, and plummeted into the crushing depths. The destruction of the Shinano was a brilliant tactical victory for a lone submarine crew that did not even fully comprehend what they had killed. But historically, the torpedoes of the Archerfish merely finished a job that Japan's own strategic collapse had started. The rapid sinking of the world's largest carrier was not an isolated tragedy. It was a glaring symptom of a massive imperial machine that had already died from within. To understand how deep that internal death had spread, you only need to look at the rest of the Japanese fleet. In the late summer and autumn of 1944, Japanese industry actually managed to finish a completely new class of fleet carriers, the Amagi the Unryu, and the Katsuragi all slid into the water and were formally commissioned into the Imperial Navy. But none of them ever launched a coordinated combat strike. They possessed the pristine flight decks and the heavy arresting gear, but they had no air groups to deploy. There were no veteran flight leaders left to command them, no high-octane fuel to fill their bunkers, and no safe shipping lanes in which to train. Instead of projecting power across the Pacific, these brand-new carriers were reduced to hiding. They were desperately camouflaged against the coastlines of the home islands, with netting and fake foliage, sitting completely idle. When they were finally forced to move, they suffered the same humiliating fate as the Leviathan that preceded them. The Unryu was utilized as a desperate transport ship, loaded down with ammunition and the exact same Ohka suicide rockets that the Shinano had carried, and sent on a cargo run to the Philippines. Just 3 weeks after the Shinano went to the bottom, the Unryu was also intercepted by an American submarine and blown apart. This was the terrifying illusion of Japanese power in the final year of the Pacific War. The Empire had not lost its ability to bend metal. They still possessed the shipyards, the dry docks, and the sheer engineering willpower of a global superpower. What they had permanently lost was the invisible software required to operate that massive hardware. The entire fragile ecosystem that transforms a flat steel deck into a lethal weapon, the thousands of hours of peacetime flight training, the vast logistical supply chains, the fuel reserves, and the irreplaceable human capital had been eradicated. Without that living network, an aircraft carrier is completely paralyzed. It ceases to be a platform of war and becomes nothing more than a giant steel target waiting in the dark. The ultimate tragedy of the Shinano was not that 4 torpedoes found its hull on the cold November night. It is that the bizarre evolution of this single ship perfectly mirrored the agonizing death of the empire that built it. In 1940, the colossal keel laid down in Yokosuka was forged as an artillery answer to the United States. 2 years later, in the ashes of Midway, that exact same steel was reshaped into an aviation answer. And yet, 4 years after that, it sailed into the Pacific carrying only the weapons of suicide, destroyed by an enemy submarine that did not even know its name. The USS Archerfish undeniably killed the massive ship in a single night, but the agonizing metamorphosis of the Shinano, from super-battleship to armored support carrier to a desperate transport for the dead, stands as the ultimate proof that Japanese naval strategy had already been dying for years.